Africa seeks to trade a lot more with herself as the Continental Free Trade Area comes into effect. And we'll also be examining a look at the hope and gloom that we're seeing in the aviation sector across the continent.
I think about the last 6 minutes a lot. My wife and my mom-in-law knew they were going to die. They had to somehow comfort the children during those final moments, knowing they were all their last. I wish I was there with them. It never leaves me that my family's flesh is there in Ethiopia, mixed with the soil, jet fuel.
So then, we'll start our year in review in trade. To date, at least 26 countries, that's roughly half of the signatories of the CFTA, have ratified the Continental Free Trade Area Agreement. And that's well ahead of its formal start of trading under its rules on the 1st of July in 2020. Now, according to the United Nations Economic Commission on Africa, the deal could potentially raise intra-African trade by anywhere between $50 to $70 billion by 2040. Before July 2020, however, negotiations are still running on a full range of issues, from how to set up rules of origin to what tariff concessions each country can and should make. So ultimately, the question is, what should you expect once trading under CFTA rules does get underway? And what do countries need to do before then to get ready? Here's the perspective from the African Union's Commissioner for Trade and Industry, Albert Muchanga.
We are preparing a schedule of tariff concessions on trade in goods, which means that the member states will be making tariff offers to liberalize trade. And the agreed level initially is 90%. And then there's an additional 70%, which is coming from sensitive products. Only 3% is going to be restricted. This is from what is called the exclusion list. So come 1st of July 2020, we expect 90% liberalization to start. The process will start. It will not be immediate 90%. It will take some time, but it will start.
All right, then, so let's dig into this subject and my guests on the program. From the Ethiopian capital, we have Zemedine Nagatu, who's the chair of the Fairfax Africa Fund. With me in the studio here in the Kenyan capital, Nairobi, is Kwame Owino, who's the CEO of the Institute of Economic Affairs here in Kenya. My first question is to both of you, gentlemen. I'm going to start with you, Kwame, though. What do we need to do to make the CFTA work? It's very ambitious, but it's one thing to have the ambition here, but making it work is a whole different story.
Well, I think that they need a small and smart program. I think they shouldn't go for too much. In my view, one of the things that's very possible to complete very quickly is a customs union, and obviously, a customs union basically. So once you have a customs union, it means that we have common rules for what comes in and what goes out, and just having open the borders. I think a monetary union, in my view, is not just a bad idea. It's going to complicate everything else quite a bit. So if they have that smart program, which is to get us as quickly as is possible to a customs union, agree to the rules and execute it, building from the existing blocks, then that can happen very, very quickly, and that would be extremely valuable.
Right. Zemedine, from your perspective in Ethiopia, what needs to be done in order to make the CFTA work?
Right, so a number of things. Obviously, it's good news that Ethiopia, which is the headquarters of the African Union, was one of the leaders in ratifying the CFTA, so that's a good sign. From not just from the Ethiopian perspective, I would like to speak from a Pan-African perspective. First and foremost, it sounds simple and straightforward, but we need to stay focused. I think it's good news that Africa has come this far in such a relatively short period of time, but there's a lot to be done, as the Commissioner just indicated in his remarks. Something like 90% of it has to be in place in terms of tariffs harmonization. And most importantly, by the way, it's not just the tariffs and other things, but infrastructure has been one of the major impediments for inter-Africa trade not to grow. So I think a focus on that area is also important. But in general, I think there are a number of things, as I said, harmonizations of the trades and tariffs. The tax regimes need to be harmonized, or at least looked at, to make sure that no one country is disadvantaged or one other country has an advantage over others. So the fairness aspects has to be continuously focused on and be demonstrated by actual legislations. And at the end of the day, the things that we need to put together is to make sure that everybody feels that they're in it together and they'll benefit from it. If that happens, I think it took the European Union, 50 years to get to where we are, actually more than 50 years. We shouldn't expect Africa to be there by June 2020, but at least make sure that the initial first steps, the concrete steps, are done to get this launched by June 2020.
Kwame, at the end of the day, though, this really is a political process as well, isn't it? And that's ultimately where this comes down to, where the rubber meets the road, so to speak, because governments will always try and protect what they deem as politically sensitive areas. So along those lines, what are the key risks that you're seeing to implementation by July?
Okay, I think one of those, of course, is that we have interest groups on all sides of, across every border. And they're definitely interested in actually capturing and maintaining their hold on domestic markets. Even in Kenya, you can see
sugar
the
is a
argument.
prime example of that.
Precisely. So we are arguing here about whether the milk that comes from Uganda, which is cheaper, is necessarily bad for consumers. I think that's definitely going to happen. So we're going to have business lobbies and very powerful lobbies trying to actually drop, or rather, to hold barriers to continue to exist. And what that means is necessarily that everybody will try as much as possible to take a defensive attitude, which is not useful. But yes, they have quite some political power. And
fundamentally, it really won't work. Zemetene, Ethiopia is a very interesting case study here, though, because it's signed up to a very limited range of trade blocs. I know it's a member of COMESA. It has AGOA access to the United States. It's got an EPU with an EPA rather with the European Union. So, assuming, just for the sake of argument, assuming it eventually does join the WTO or maybe the AAC later on, how would it balance these obligations across these various trade blocs and various trade rules?
Right. Very good point. By the way, you said assuming Ethiopia will join the WTO. I think I want to just give you news here. The government recently has announced that it is joining the WTO, probably in 2020. I think very likely in 2020. So it's no longer an if. As you know, it's probably one of the longest accession processes of any country ever that joined the WTO that Ethiopia has been on. But since the new reforms, the economic reform program was announced, the government made very strong steps to join the WTO. As you also mentioned, Ethiopia is not a member of the East African community. It, for a long time, it shied away from these sort of regional trading blocs. And to be very frank with you, even me, I wasn't quite comfortable that Ethiopia should join these trading blocs, but it really would have been a huge disadvantage. But now that it is becoming one of the major manufacturing export hubs of Africa and exporting to around the world, the next step for Ethiopia would be to join these, these regional trading blocs, WTO, because it will be one of the major beneficiaries, because it will now be exporting to the neighborhood. Today, for example, I'll give you real life examples. I chair a global manufacturing company, a European company that has set up shop. We now export around the world. We have 5,000 stores around the world. We're now exporting to the US, to Europe and all that, but we're not exporting anything to Africa. But through this liberalization, they're opening up the regional trade blocs. Our next focus is going to be right here in the neighborhood, not just the neighborhood, all the way to West Africa. So Ethiopia has decided at the right time to open up and join this trading bloc. So it's the right time. I just wanted to add something earlier, which I failed to do. One of the success for the CFTA to succeed, we can't be having winners or losers, or at least the perception of some countries are winning and others losing. So that is one of the key attributes we have to look for when we measure the success, or not, I don't want to say the failure, but the drag out of the implementation of the CFTA. Everybody has to feel like they're benefiting from it.
Okay, so Kwame, at the end of the day, to come back to that same question, if you're looking at the Kenyan situation, if you're a manufacturer here, Ethiopia is coming in from the north, right? They've got their goods coming into this market, but you're a member of the East African community and COMESA. Now you've got an EPA with the EU, and on top of that, you've got the CFTA. There's so many different layers here. How do we balance out the relationship between these trade blocs?
I think that's one of the reasons that the free trade area is obviously an imperative. Because yes, you have too many rules and all of those rules are not necessarily compatible with each other. So if we go through a customs union at the continental level, then obviously it gives us or rather will put onto it the rules that we have already committed to in other places. The most important thing is it's going to create coherence within the African continent. And I think that's a good thing. So what we do is start with what exists and ask ourselves, how does the EAC, for instance, handle the fact that its members have memberships, or rather its members have obligations in other trade rules. And obviously, if it's harmonized at that level, then you create those as the minimum, or rather as the floors, and you build from that. So it's not exactly impossible, but I think the fact that you just have Kenya itself as a member, benefiting from AGOA, the EPAs, we have COMESA and all that, tells you that we actually need one coherent trade arrangement.
So essentially you reduce all this paperwork into just one rule book.
Precisely, so that you just have one consistent way of dealing with trade.
Zemaden, I'm going to come to you. I know you love making the case for Afro-optimism, to essentially believe that things can work, but I'm going to ask you to take the opposite perspective here. What would make the CFTA implode?
What would make the CFTA fail is the lack of political commitment. I think, at the macro level. Now, obviously, not applying the smart technical details, as I said, from trade harmonization, the tax harmonization, and not building sufficient infrastructure for these things, for the goods, in particular for goods to move across Africa, will make it fail. But at the top of the game is it will fail if the political commitment, the will, is not there. Now, I would like to believe, as you said, I'm always an Afro-optimist. We've gotten this far. I don't think 5 years ago, no one would have expected for Africa to have come this far so quickly. So I'm still very optimistic, but there's still, some work to be done. Remember, the lesson we need to learn from others, and I've spent many years in Latin America when Mercosur was being put together. It took years. So we need to set realistic goals as well, so that people don't lose, don't get discouraged if they don't see the positive upsides in a relative short period of time. We have to tell the politicians and the general public, this thing takes time, but we're getting there, and put the KPIs, the quick wins, so that the public can back these things, because we've seen these kinds of things fail in other parts because the political will fail because the public didn't support it. I think I'm confident in Africa it won't happen, but we still have to guard against that.
Indeed. Gentlemen, you're going to be with me for another part of the program, but essentially that wraps up our conversation on trade in Africa. Now, in many ways, the aviation industry was yet another large megatrend in our business coverage in 2019 for a whole host of reasons. But there's one story that dominated headlines pretty much across the board, and it took place on the morning of the 10th of March. Ethiopian Airlines Flight 302, a recently delivered brand new Boeing 737 MAX, took off from Addis Ababa on what should have been a routine flight headed to the Kenyan capital, Nairobi. But 6 minutes later, contact was lost at the control tower at Bola International Airport. As we all later found out, the plane had crashed some 50 kilometers outside the Ethiopian capital, killing all 157 people on board. This is a timeline of those events.
On the 10th of March 2019 at 8:38 a.m., Ethiopian Airlines Flight 302 takes off from Bola International Airport, Addis Ababa, en route to Nairobi. Shortly afterwards, the pilot issues a distress call and is told to return. At 8:44 a.m., contact with the plane is lost. At 10:48 a.m., the office of Ethiopia's Prime Minister in a Twitter post gives first word of the crash. 3 hours later, Ethiopia's state broadcaster says all 149 passengers, made up of 35 nationalities and 8 crew members, are dead. On the 11th of March, Ethiopian Airlines says the 2 flight data recorders from Flight 302 have been recovered as airlines around the world began grounding Boeing 737 MAX 8s. 2 days later, on March 14th, the flight data recorders are flown to France, where the country's Civil Air Safety Investigation Authority begins analyzing them.
Now, in the wake of that crash and a similar one in November 2018 involving a Lion Air plane which plunged into the Java Sea, investigations zeroed in on an automated system called MCAS. Now, Boeing say that they designed this system, the Maneuvering Characteristics Augmentation System, in order to prevent the 737 MAX with its much bigger engines placed further forward from pitching up and essentially stalling. In practice, however, the system erroneously pointed the plane's nose down, even as pilots struggle to override it. Victims' families have now filed a lawsuit. They're accusing the plane maker of negligence.
I think about the last 6 minutes a lot. My wife and my mom-in-law knew they were going to die. They had to somehow comfort the children during those final moments, knowing they were all their last. I wish I was there with them. It never leaves me that my family's flesh is there in Ethiopia, mixed with the soil, the jet fuel, and pieces of the aircraft.
Now, if you pull out and look at the air transport sector from a larger perspective, air transportation is still the safest form of long-distance travel that we have as a species. And those in the aviation industry say they're committed to making it even safer. But over the last decade, the industry has seen a 54% improvement in the all-accident rate. But beneath that positive rate, some say that this is an industry that's making deeply questionable decisions in getting their products approved. CGTN's Daniel Arap Moy explores that.
Statistics from the International Air Transport Association indicates that the world's airlines provided about 4 billion passengers the freedom to travel over a global network of some 22,000 routes in 2018. During the same year, airlines also enabled the freedom to do business globally by transporting 64 million tons of cargo to markets around the world. This activity supported a third of global trade by value, generated 65 million jobs and underpinned 2.7 trillion of gross domestic product. Business aside, everyone in air transport remained shocked and challenged by the crashes of Boeing 737 MAX aircraft operated by Lion Air on 29th October 2018 and Ethiopian Airlines, which occurred on 10th March 2019. These two tragedies, occurring only 4 months apart under what appear to be broadly similar circumstances, led to the global grounding of this mode of aircraft.
According to the International Air Transport Association, there were 11 fatal accidents that resulted in 523 fatalities among passengers and crew.
I want to emphasize right up front that the number one goal here is safely returning, and the FAA and the regulators around the globe will pace the schedule. And they'll only do it when the aircraft's safe, and we're fully supportive of that approach.
According to IATA, 9 of the 11 fatal accidents in 2018 were passenger operations, which accounted for 98% of all fatalities.
Across the entire Boeing company, regardless of where our employee base is located, we are committed to making certain that we do right by them.
Despite the tragic events of 2019, the industry continues its 10-year trend of declining accident rates and fatality risks. Daniel Arap Moy, CGTN, Nairobi, Kenya.
Now, the story of aviation in Africa in 2019 wasn't just about safety issues. There was also a very strong business element to it as well. Some countries like Nigeria, Tanzania and Ghana are trying to revive their national carriers. In South Africa, authorities finally put SAA into administration, and lawmakers in Kenya decided to renationalize an airline that was partially privatized in 1996, even though the funding plan for that is not clear. As CGTN's Terry Wangari explains, the focus in 2020 is going to be about getting these firms off the ground.
2019 has seen the rebirth of African national airlines. Away from the gloom, in November, the Dubai Air Show 2019 saw a series of agreements and MOUs signed. During the air show, U.S. plane maker Boeing announced deals with Egypt, TAAG Angola Airlines and South African carrier Fly SA Fair. The agreements revolve around maintenance, engineering and technical assistance as well as digital maintenance support for the aircrafts. Ghana announced its intent to purchase GEnx 1B engines for its 3 B7879 Dreamliners during the show. The engine order is valued at more than $150 million list price. Boeing and Ghana signed a memorandum of understanding for the airplanes with a current list price of $877.5 million to relaunch a national airline. Air Senegal signed a memorandum of understanding for 8 A220-300 Airbus aircrafts. The aircraft type is a quick choice for the national carrier because of its flexibility and reliability. The aircrafts are expected to fly to cities like Lagos, London and Geneva. They'll be included in the carrier's fleet by 2021 to be delivered 2 per year by Airbus. Aside from the Dubai Air Show, Africa's aviation sector saw some big wins this year. Uganda Airlines successfully completed its non-stop maiden flight to Mombasa, Kenya. The direct flight takes exactly 2 hours and 40 minutes. The new route is operated by a CRJ 900 aircraft. Air Tanzania received a second B7878 Dreamliner in October. The additional aircraft has helped the Tanzanian carrier expand its flight services from Dar es Salaam to Mumbai, India. Additional long-haul flights are in the offering. The airline intends to launch services to London Gatwick and to Guangzhou in China. Terry Wangari, CGTN.
All right, thank God to get through in the world of aviation, and especially what governments and businesses are doing in that space. My guest from Addis Ababa, Azamedine Negatu from Fairfax Africa Fund, and of course Kwame Wino, the CEO of Institute of Economic Affairs, is still with me in studio. Kwame, Kenyan legislators decided to renationalize KQ this year, but simply put, can we afford it?
I don't think we can unless they do some, or rather they cannot, we cannot afford Kenya Airways in the same fashion in which it had been run for 2 reasons. One, it wasn't making enough money to pay for itself, but also because Kenya's finances at this moment are just probably the worst. So that convergence of factors just tells you that even with the renationalization, I think there's still going to be quite a lot of cutting that's going to have to be done if this airline is going to work, because it doesn't look like they're going to find a strategic partner who's prepared to pump money in.
So essentially the status quo might remain for now.
Yes, of course, the status quo might remain, but obviously it'll just sink deeper and deeper. I don't think that they have enough cash to keep it running for all the routes, and at the same time keep some of the expenses and investments that are required to as part of the original plan. So.
Right. Zamedene, Ethiopian Airlines, it's the only profitable carrier that we have, the only profitable large carrier we have here in Africa. It's had sterling year after sterling year as far as business is concerned. Might part of it be up for sale at some point?
Well, the government, as you know, Ramah, has announced a wide-ranging privatization program. The ones that are initially slated will be the telecoms, the sugar, and others. At the back end of it, there is some indication that Ethiopian Airlines might also have some form of privatization. In fact, in my view, and this is just my view, the form of privatization for Ethiopian Airlines is not going to be the standard one that you expect where the government offloads the airline. We have already seen what it would look like. The cargo business has already been partially privatized. It's now a joint venture with DHL. So my team and I, we've done about 14 African transaction advisory over the last 15 years. So we have a fairly good idea of what would work in the airline business. I think what I expect will be some of the standalone business units. For example, the Aviation Academy could be a JV with another big global company that runs that very well. MRO is a classic example where we can have a joint venture with a global MRO operator. Catering, but not the core long-haul, extremely successful, extremely profitable airline business. I'm not so sure. It's already, in fact, Ethiopian Airlines is actually an acquirer. As you know, it owns virtually all airlines that have been started in the last few years or about to be started in Africa. So it's an acquisition mode. So I'm not expecting the core passenger airline business to be privatized, but the others are natural JV partnership models, and that's, I think the cargo should give an indication as to if any of the other business will privatize. That would probably be the model, because in fact, just this week Ethiopian Airlines started flying to Houston. I saw some numbers, which is very impressive. As an African, we should make us all feel good. By flying to Houston, Ethiopian Airlines will be pumping in something like over $100 million annually to the Houston economy, an African country contributing $100 million to the American economy just because it's flying there, because it's bringing in tourists and passengers from business. So I don't see that model where you see in other countries privatization of companies being offloading the government stake. I don't see that for the core business. But for the other parts, it's only natural, and the cargo is probably the way the others will be JV'd as well.
Okay, speaking of JVs though, I think one of the last deals that we've seen in this month, at least within East Africa, is Rwanda. They sold 60% of the new airport that they're building in Bugesera to Qatar Airways. That's valued at about $1.3 billion or so. From Ethiopian Airlines' perspective, as someone who's invested in the airline space, how big a potential competitor is Rwanda?
So I get asked this question all the time. Let me put something in perspective. 80% of into and out of Africa air travel is done by non-African carriers. 80%. So we only today, African carriers have only 20%. So there isn't really a concern that Rwanda Air will take business from Ethiopian, or Ethiopian will take business from A-Sky or whatever. I don't think that should be our focus. Our focus as Africans should be, how do we reduce that 80%? And it's actually the other way around, that African carriers move 80% of the passengers and non-African carriers move the other 20%. That should be our focus, not Rwanda Air or any other African carrier. In fact, the other thing I want to make sure is almost every airline, no African airline today, with the exception of Ethiopian Airline, makes money. I mean, that's a big statement. Not a single African carrier makes money. That should tell you that there's something wrong with the aviation, with the airline business in Africa. So one of the solutions I've given, and others I'm sure will concur with me, is we need to create size. This is a very expensive business. So each African country going out on its own, creating standalones, wanting to fly long haul, in the long term is doomed for failure. Europe has only 3 carriers, 3 airline groups: Air France, KLM, Lufthansa, and IAG, which is the British Airways and Iberia. Okay? 3. And that's an economy that's infinitely bigger than Africa's GDP. And they just have 3 of them. In the United States, we have just essentially 5 carriers. It's big, a big consolidation took place in the last 5, 6, 7 years. There's just 5 carriers control 80% of the American airline business. So why is it that in Africa we think this model where everybody goes out and buys these shiny little aircrafts at very expensive prices, wanting to fly long haul, thinks it would work? It won't. So let's create partnerships amongst African carriers.
Right.
So for example, Ethiopian Airlines has started this model where it's partnering with everybody. I think that's the way we should go, not fear each other.
Right, and I totally agree with you on this. Kwame, let me come to you on this. The fact of the matter is that, as Zemedene is arguing, not everyone can afford an airline, right? And this is a huge business. It essentially relies on razor-thin margins, big matters. Aren't African governments missing that point, and they're just focusing on trying to create these little airlines instead of just having a proper open skies market?
Precisely. I mean, I think that, for instance, in East Africa, to have 5, 6 airlines, all competing in addition to the external ones, simply tells you that
because
lot
now
of
Tanzania has a carrier,
yes,
Kenya has a carrier, Rwanda has a carrier,
Uganda
is of course setting up one.
Yes, and of course we have the Ethiopian one, which is largely East African. So you have 5 of those. If you talk about those alone, I think it's clear that all of them are going to struggle if they have to keep competing. So all the governments that take a nationalist view about establishing airlines are definitely making a mistake, partly because, not just because of East Africa where the market is small in relative terms, but even globally, running an airline profitably is a very, very difficult thing. Few airlines actually keep that record of positive returns for up to a decade. So they can't do that in the US, not all of them are capable of doing that in Europe. They just select airlines globally. I think less than 10 that actually have made money over the last 5 years consistently. So obviously, here we are. I mean, what would make sense, obviously, is the joint ventures, but more importantly, perhaps for all of East Africa to converge into a single one. 2 would probably be possible, but the 5 that we have, and with ambitions for many more, I think it's going to be a lot of money thrown down the drain.
All right, Zemedene, one last question for you. Ethiopia doesn't have an equities market, an active equities market at the moment, but let's just take that argument a little further. Assuming that the Ethiopian government would decide to offload a minority stake in any of the businesses that you mentioned, maybe the cargo side or something else, some other part of the enterprise, would it be open to selling those shares at the Nairobi bourse?
I think this is only natural that we have, first of all, just for your viewers to understand, at the moment there's no stock market or equity market in Ethiopia, but in late 2020, probably early 2021, there'll be a stock market in Ethiopia. Probably it's called the Addis Ababa Stock Exchange. So one of the suggestions some of us have, and I'm sure the government has thought about, is offloading, doing IPOs of some of the state-owned enterprises, partial IPOs on the Addis Ababa Stock Exchange. But ultimately, as you know, Ramah, standalone stock exchanges, again, using the airline model argument I made, probably are not viable in Africa either. So probably cross-listings with Nairobi, cross-listings with JSC. I think that would be one of the ways to create bulk. Africa's entire GDP, as optimistic as I am, is equal to Brazil's GDP, all 54 countries. So it's relatively small. So when you fragment it, it doesn't appeal very much to international investors, even for domestic investors. So the cross-listing will be one of the approaches, but first you have to offload it on the newly soon-to-be established stock exchange, because there's a lot of companies, even part of Ethiopian Airlines, some of the other businesses I mentioned could all be offloaded, including the cargo business and the catering business and the MRO. The telco, which is going to be partially privatized this coming March, will also be. And a lot of the MNCs, especially the FMCG MNCs now it's coming into Ethiopia, like they're doing in Kenya, can now offload, do IPOs of their local Ethiopian operations on the new soon to be established, and then have cross-listing with Nairobi, have cross-listing with Dar and other places, all the way up to Nigeria. So the approach in Africa, we started this program talking about CFTA, right? Yeah. So what we need to think about is creating bulk across all industries in Africa if we're going to be competitive globally.
All right, I don't think I can find a better way of ending that. Gentlemen, just hold on for one moment, because our viewers, of course, have been looking at this topic, debating about it intensely online for most of the year. So we did ask you what you think of plans to re-establish national carriers or expand or downsize, depending on the country you're on. Jerry Owili from our social media team has been looking at your views. So what are the people saying?
Well, thanks, Roma. And indeed, Africa's aviation industry has elicited quite some mixed reactions on social media. Now, despite that devastating crash in March, Ethiopian Airlines is still a favorite among air travelers in the continent. Suresh Neleyapan says the Ethiopian carrier is disciplined and has a dedicated team from top to bottom with no interference from politicians. He goes on to say that it has the right pricing and relatively good service. Suresh goes on to say that the airline will soon rule Africa and even part of the Asian skies. Sosa Nemera, on the other hand, says that success comes from the blessings of God. The success story of the Ethiopian Airlines was prophesied a decade ago, and she continues on to say that the carrier will be a giant company in the world in the days to come. But some viewers were skeptical of Africa's aviation industry, particularly in Ghana, Kenya and South Africa. Richard Apollos from Ghana believes that the country cannot afford to purchase 3 Boeing Dreamliners. He says even if Ghana Airways is revived, it will still crumble again so long as corruption persists in the country. Musa Kigundu, on the other hand, feels that some airlines seem to be headed in the right direction, especially with better management. Now, he says Rwanda Air is one of the examples of these airlines that might move in the forward direction. Daniel Weru, on the other hand, says aviation in Africa is generally poor. According to him, Ethiopian Airlines is not only the best in Africa, but also the best in the world. He goes on to say, I think Kenya Airways and other airlines should do a benchmarking from Ethiopian Airlines. And finally, Eugene from South Africa says, South African Airways has simply been plagued by corruption. We're just hoping that maybe 2020 can bring better tidings, especially for these airlines that are struggling, probably Kenya Airways, South African Airways, and the others. We hope for a better year for them next year.
Indeed. Kwame, quick reactions? What do you make?
Well, I think, yes, we have them. I think there's the optimism that everybody expects, but my view about it is that the airlines that we have, they're buying these very big planes that require huge servicing costs and at the same time require very specialized pilots, very specialized facilities. Not all of them have them. So, for instance, the 787 that Tanzania has flies twice a week to Mumbai. That can't even pay for its own operation costs. So unless something happens in terms of the massive expansion in the number of people who travel, the price sensitivity at the same time as the global market gets better, then obviously that is, but it's not a good sign for many of them.
All right, Zamadena in Addis, any last thoughts on Africa's aviation market and where we're headed in 2020?
Right. A very simple message. The airline is a business. It needs to be run like a business. It cannot be patronage jobs. Corporate governance has been the Achilles heel for the failures of a lot of the African airlines. So run them like a business, like Ethiopian Airlines is. Ownership doesn't matter. Who owns it, whether it's private or government, is really irrelevant. Otherwise, both Ethiopian Airlines and Emirates would not have been successful. They're both owned by government, but they're exceptionally successful. I just want to point one final point, though. Just to encourage Africans that it is doable when you run it well. Ethiopian Airlines today is the 5th biggest airline in the world by number of countries it serves. Get that, the 5th biggest. An African-owned, African-operated airline is now amongst the 5 largest airlines in the world by the number of destinations, the countries it serves. It is doable and is making more money than all African airlines combined. So as Africans, we have an example. We should replicate that. But the key message is we got to come together, work together, create bulk, or else I think the social media sentiment, I completely agree with you. If we get the governance right, then I think, and then the politicians step back and let the professionals run these things, I think we'll have very successful airlines in Africa. 3 or 4 big ones, and then the rest could be sort of feeders or partners to the bigger carriers. That should be the vision we have for Africa's aviation.
All right, we'll leave it there for the time being. Zamadin Nagatu live in the Ethiopian capital of Addis Ababa, and of course here with me in studio, Kwame Wino, CEO of the Institute of Economic Affairs. Gentlemen, thank you. Welcome back. Let's focus on some of the anchor economies across the continent, starting in Egypt. The North African economy continues to implement a series of economic reforms this year. 2019, remember, was the final year of a program with the IMF, which involved a $12 billion bailout. Fuel subsidies have been steadily reduced. The fiscal deficit has decreased from 16.5% in 2014 to 8.2% this year. Now, the Egyptian pound, which was floated as part of this program, has also appreciated against the American dollar by about 10% this year. Here's GTN's Yasser Hakim now with a review of the key events of the year.
It's been an eventful year economically, but we've chosen 3 events that have shaped the economic reforms of 2019. First is the closure of the $12 billion IMF loan. Egypt received the money over 3 years, the last batch in June 2019. The loan has been linked with austerity measures that included the devaluation of the Egyptian pound. Another event is the decision to raise the minimum wage in July. It's been stable for years. The new salary raise is meant to cushion the low-income earners amidst the aggressive reform measures.
These are several procedures aimed at relieving the burden of the Egyptians in these circumstances as we continue our reforms. We are raising the minimum wage on all employees from, do you know how much? We are raising the minimum wage from 1,200 Egyptian pounds to 2,000 pounds. We will also announce an annual raise of 7% to 10% for all government employees.
The central bank has been active during the year. It has cut interest rates 3 times in 2019. Rates have dropped from 15 to 13%. Inflation has also dropped from 30% in 2018 to an average 10% by October 2019.
It's a comprehensive program requested to us by the Egyptian president in 2015. The central bank was asked to do all it can to place the Egyptian economy on a stable financial footing. This is not only about reforming the financial sector and the forex system, but a comprehensive economic plan to create revenue that will fund the government's developmental goals.
An increase in foreign reserves, the gradual strengthening of the Egyptian pound, and lower inflation numbers have earned the CBE governor a new 4-year term in office this December. 2020 will be about more economic reforms. The government will focus on attracting foreign investments and reopening closed factories. Yas Hakim for CGTN, Cairo.
Africa's most industrialized economy, South Africa, is under a ton of pressure. Power cuts, industrial unrest and falling government revenues. These are all combining into a deadly cocktail. Sumitra Naidu joins us now for a look at the key events in that particular country. Sumitra, one of the big trends in South Africa this year has been the country's rising unemployment levels. It's been stuck at record levels of 29%. Why hasn't the country been able to bring that metric down?
So, Ramah, it's a combination of factors. South Africa is suffering very low growth, and with companies unable to invest and expand, there are very few job opportunities. But going back before this low growth situation, there's the issue of policy. The country's plans to create jobs have been too ambitious and not well suited for this population. The IMF released an interesting report a few years back saying that South Africa needed to change its focus to concentrate on more artisanal skills, technical trade, education has been another area that leads to this, and maybe the most fundamental failure of this government. Yes, more children have access to schooling today, but the quality of the education has been so poor that the system has failed to produce the results needed to grow this economy, to create those jobs. The unions too play a major role. There have been some major strides in human rights and workers' rights, but workers have been given, more dignity with the minimum wage. But, the debate around whether it's actually working and whether it's achieving its intended purpose, that debate continues. Listen to this clip from Sizwe Palmer, the COSATU spokesperson, on his view on why unemployment hasn't actually, worked in, employment rather, hasn't grown in South Africa.
So far, government has really failed to implement what we thought were proposals that were going to work. Remember, like we said, we went to the job summit. The fact of the matter is that when we have a budget that is still tailor-made to actually assist big corporations and multinationals, then we're in trouble, especially when it comes to reducing unemployment. We have all witnessed on a daily basis big corporations deciding to replace workers with machines.
What's the 2020 outlook for the country? Because the IMF has growth barely over 1.1% next year. That's virtually standing still. But what policy changes are needed to get South Africa back on track?
It's a rather grim outlook, Ramah. Just over a week ago, the IMF issued a stern warning to South Africa, saying it needed to get its house in order. We have a serious debt problem. We're nearing 60% debt to GDP. Unemployment stands at a record high of 29.1%. And the power cuts have just compounded all of these problems. And we may see a further deterioration in the growth forecast for 2019. The Treasury and the South African Reserve Bank lowered their forecast to just 0.5%. Many economists believe that 0.5% is unlikely at this stage. It's probably going to be a lot lower than that. Let's take a listen to Kevin Lings, economist from Stanlib.
It's very clear that the South African economy has, for the last 5 years, been under very significant pressure. And we've got to realize that a huge amount of damage has been done to this country in the last 5 to 10 years. Government finances have deteriorated, institutional capacity has been diminished. We can see that in, say, the revenue services, the National Prosecuting Authority. It all takes time to rebuild that. We think we've started the rebuild program, and I think there has been progress made, but clearly it's still going to be a number of years before you see that rebuild of the South African economy reflected in better growth outcomes.
Now, in the West, Africa's largest economy and largest oil producer is still struggling to find its economy firing on all cylinders. Nigeria fell into its first recession in a quarter of a century in 2016. It got out of that the following year. But as CGTN's Deji Badmus now explains, that recovery has been a slow and painful process.
Well, 2019 has been more or less a topsy-turvy year for Nigeria's economy. It's the year the country was supposed to have consolidated its recovery from recession. First quarter GDP was modestly optimistic at 2.01%, but by the second quarter it tumbled down to 1.94%, only to make a modest recovery in the third quarter at 2.28%. Fourth quarter GDP is being expected, but the horizon doesn't seem so bright, especially for 2020, with the World Bank warning that the country could slip back into recession for a second time in 3 years should oil prices crash below $50 per barrel. By the way, Nigeria is still heavily dependent on revenue from crude sales to drive its economy. At the continental level, after initially dithering, Nigeria eventually signed up to the Africa Continental Free Trade Area in July. Africa's largest economy had initially held off its signature after local manufacturers here had complained that certain aspects of the deal could harm them and wanted guarantees that every party would play by the rule book. But just months after signing the AfTA agreement, Nigeria shorts its land border with Benin and Niger, two very important trade routes between Nigeria and the rest of the West African sub-region. Talks are actually on among the countries to get the border reopened. Another big story for the Nigerian economy this year is the decision of the central bank compelling commercial banks in the country to increase their loan-to-deposit ratio. Earlier, Nigeria's deposit money banks had among the lowest LDR on the continent, but with the directive of the CBN, LDR is now a minimum of 65%. The whole idea is to increase lending to the real sector of the economy. And one last thing, 2019 is one year Nigerian workers will remember with at least some smile. After a long-drawn negotiation, the government raised the national minimum wage to $84. It sure doesn't look like a big deal, but when you consider the fact that the national minimum wage had remained at about $50 for close to a decade, then you would understand why this is actually something worth celebrating for the workers. 2020 does not look bright for Nigeria's economy. The government is projecting a GDP growth rate of 2.93%, but all eyes will be on the crude oil market. If prices fall below the government budget benchmark of $57 per barrel, then the country may have to hit the panic button. Let's just hope that doesn't happen. Deji Badmos, CGTN, Lagos, Nigeria.
Over in Zimbabwe, on the other hand, 2019 was a year to forget as it was hit by a barrage of problems, both natural and man-made. The country experienced its worst economic crisis in a decade, marked by inflation that was well over 300%, as well as shortages of critical commodities like food and fuel. Power cuts of at least 12 hours a day have been routine this year. The United Nations World Food Programme says it is struggling to raise more than $200 million to deal with food insecurity in the country. The economic collapse and recurring droughts in the country, which once was the breadbasket of Southern Africa, has now left millions of people without enough to eat.
Drought, destruction and darkness. That's how 2019 kicked off, with destroyed crops, cyclone devastation and distress due to power cuts. To try and steady things, Zimbabwean authorities implemented austerity measures, tightening of the belts that didn't go down so well with civil servants. And so there were plenty of showdowns as workers demonstrated over their wages that have been rapidly eroded by a demon from the past back to haunt Zimbabwe again. Inflation. It's now in triple-digit territory and rising, putting paid to projections that it would come down to single-digit territory by the end of the year. Also down the drain are GDP projections that had initially expected growth, but now concede an undesirable minus 6.5% contraction. Not even the reintroduction of a local currency could spark a revival. The Zim dollar bounced back as the sole legal tender in June, following the ban of foreign currencies that had been in use for the past decade. Currency was one of several reforms to try to kickstart the economy, which still remains largely informalized. Governments asked for more time to turn things around. It's upbeat that growth will be 4.5% in 2020, a lofty target that many here question, especially as they endure long queues for fuel and cash, which, along with power, have persistently been scarce all year. 2019 has been a difficult year for businesses, the hardest in a decade. Many of them will be happy to see the back of it, hoping that the new one will bring some cheer for an economy that is in transition and trying to find its way. Farang Makutuya, CGTN, Harare, Zimbabwe.
So then, what exactly does lie ahead for Zimbabwe in 2020? Let's explore this in detail with Dr. Prosper Chitambara. He's an economist. He joins me now live from Harare with more data on this story. Dr. Chitambara, the IMF is forecasting a 7% shrinkage in Zimbabwe's GDP this year. Do you agree with that assessment?
Yeah, definitely I agree with that assessment. I think this year has been a very difficult year. I think there have been a number of factors that have really resulted in the contraction of the economy by that magnitude. So I agree with the assessment by the IMF. Of course, the Minister of Finance are saying that minus 6.5%. The IMF are saying minus 7.1%. The World Bank are saying minus 7.2%. But it's largely on account of the drought, also the cyclone Idai, and the drought in particular has affected electricity generation, which is a key enabler of economic growth.
Zimbabwe has an arrears problem with international financial institutions that it needs to deal with. What needs to be done to clear that backlog of debt next year?
I think ultimately it will depend on the growth of the economy, because in my view, I think the most sustainable debt reduction strategy is actually anchored on actually growing the economy. So next year, the minister is projecting that the economy may grow by between 3 and 4%. In my view, that's still overly optimistic, because even if we have good rains, that does not necessarily translate into a positive macroeconomic performance. Also, given the fact that we have also not addressed, because there are other endogenous factors that determine macroeconomic performance, like your policy factors, your institutional factors, and also the overall political environment itself. It actually provides an environment where the economy can actually begin to thrive. So those factors are not yet in place. So I think it's going to be difficult for the government this coming year to be able to service its arrears with both the bilateral and the multilateral partners. Because ultimately we need to grow the economy so that we create fiscal space to be able to sustainably clear our arrears.
Indeed. Dr. Prosper Chitambara, thank you very much for your time on the program. Well then, you're watching Global Business Africa. Time for a short break. We'll be back in a moment. Welcome back to the program. Now, Russia is the latest country to launch an aggressive campaign aimed at raising investments and bilateral trade with economies here in Africa. This year, the country's president, Vladimir Putin, hosted his first ever Africa-Russia summit in the Black Sea resort city of Sochi. Over the last 2 years, Moscow has been looking for ways to expand its reach in Africa through trade and security deals. But as far as trade and investment is concerned, it is still far, far behind the continent's main trading partners. CGTN's Ramah Nyang explores the numbers.
Currently, Africa's 3 largest commercial partners are China, the European Union and the United States. Over the last decade, China has become Africa's largest trading partner. In 2018, trade volume between China and Africa stood at $204.2 billion. Its role in Africa has been largely defined by the financing of more than 3,000 largely critical infrastructure projects. America's commercial relationship with Africa, on the other hand, is largely based on the African Growth and Opportunity Act, a non-reciprocal trade agreement that grants about 40 countries duty-free access for over 6,400 products to the U.S. market. But U.S.-Africa trade is waning. Two-way trade between the two fell from a high of $100 billion in 2008 to $39 billion in 2017, largely due to U.S. energy self-sufficiency. The European Union, meanwhile, has applied a different strategy. It has shored up its commercial positions in Africa through a web of economic partnership agreements, which Brussels is negotiating or has concluded with 40 African nations in sub-Saharan Africa. In 2017, two-way trade exceeded $300 billion. Robert Nagela, CGTN, Nairobi, Kenya.
All right, then, one last round of analysis for this year in review with my guest in Washington, D.C., Amaka Anku. So 2019, this broad trend continued where other large economies say they want to engage more with Africa, they want to invest more and trade more. Russia is the latest of this lot. But what's really triggering this renewed attention, particularly from Russia?
You know, it's hard to say. It feels like we see this sort of cycle every 9-10 years or so, right? Around 2010, we saw the last excitement about Africa. But I think that at the core of it is just the fact or the reality that Africa is sort of the last region of the world. You know, it's one of the only two fastest growing regions in the world. It's the last region where you don't have markets that are saturated. You still have a lot of people who are in poverty, who can grow disposable income and become consumers, right? And so there's a general sense of, are we positioning ourselves to be competitive when disposable incomes do take off and consumers do grow exponentially on this continent, right? So I think that's what's driving it.
Are policymakers taking this engagement seriously? Because you look at the quality of deals that are being struck around trade, around investment, for instance. Are policymakers here looking for the best possible terms of engagement?
Yeah, I think that's up for debate. I think, one of the things that is I would say very valid criticism is that, Africa as a continent and even specific African countries have never really quite defined or articulated what their strategy is for engagement with the global, with the world, right? It's not clear, what they want to get out of trade. It's not clear what they want to get out of strategic engagements, even with China, for example. It all seems to be opportunistic. That being said, I do see that the rising competition in terms of financial flows, right? The fact that you're seeing more and more flows of finance and capital from China, not only to fund big infrastructure projects that are designed and coordinated by government, but also to the private sector, particularly to tech. That's created a little bit more leverage from African countries to be able to say, look, we can get finance from Western countries or we can get it from China, and who's going to give us the best deal? I just haven't seen different countries really be thoughtful and deliberate about exactly what the strategy is, what they want to get out of it, and then pursue that clearly. So, I hope that changes.
Right. One last question for you. Some of the big macro trends that we're seeing across the world, the China-US trade on one hand and Brexit on the other, these will rumble on into 2020. How would African economies be affected, and what do they need to prepare themselves for?
That's a hard question. Africa as a continent is so marginal to the global economy, right? Africa's economy as a whole is only about over 2% of the global economy. And that means that it's been relatively insulated from, global trade tensions. There are few countries on the continent, like South Africa, who is somewhat impacted by tariffs on steel, for example. So I think that presents both an opportunity and a risk, right? The opportunity is that because you're insulated, you can continue to chart your own course. And we've seen that there, countries like China, in my view, in part because of the trade tensions with the U.S., are taking, things like technology in Africa more seriously, right? Because if China is locked out of technology, things like SIMs, manufactured in the U.S., having access to a 1.2 billion per person market and potentially 3.5 trillion market can give it a serious advantage in the race to 5G, for example, and just the cold tech war. That's the way in which it could be negative if these countries are not being strategic about how they engage, right? But I see both an opportunity to be valuable in the fact, that you have this vast market that hasn't been tapped, and also a risk because there could be a downturn in demand for global commodities, and that's what most African countries are selling, commodities. So if the trade tensions between the U.S. and China slows down global growth, it will have an impact on Africa.
Indeed. Amaka Anku in Washington, D.C., thank you very much for your insights on the program tonight. And that's it for this special edition of Global Business Africa. As always, we'd like to hear your thoughts and your feedback on the content you've seen on this program. There's several ways to get your thoughts back to us. All of them are on your screens right now. I'm Ramah Nyang in the Kenyan capital, Nairobi. Thank you for your company on this program and the entire year. The World Today is up next from Washington, D.C.